The grand diplomatic dinner of the unseen courts was, by all accounts, a crushing bore. It was an event held once a decade, primarily to remind the younger, more impetuous covens that the old guard still held the reins. For King Ashton, sovereign of the Onyx Throne and Lord of the Seven Nocturnes, it was the seventh such dinner he had presided over in his long, long life. The novelty had worn off somewhere around the fall of the Byzantine Empire. He stood on a low dais, a chalice of the finest O-negative in his hand, surveying the room with the preternatural stillness that unnerved even his own kind. He had not shifted his weight in 40 minutes. He had not blinked in 12. A lesser vampire might have fidgeted. Ashton simply existed, like a monument someone had forgotten to unveil. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust, beeswax, and the cloying perfume of a dozen vampire duchesses vying for his attention. Beneath it all, threaded through like silk through burlap, was the warm copper note of the human dignitaries scattered through the crowd. Their heartbeats formed a low, distracting percussion that Ashton had long since learned to tune out. Mostly. He was a portrait of monarchical perfection, clad in black velvet tailored to a standard that had made 3 generations of the same artisan family weep with effort, his dark, shoulder-length hair falling in a controlled wave against the marble pallor of his skin. No flush of blood warmed his cheeks. No breath fogged the air before him, though the grand hall was cold enough that the human guests clutched their wine for warmth. He was composed, he was powerful. He was, in a word, bored out of his immortal skull. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the usual suspects with the lazy precision of a predator surveying a familiar hunting ground. Lord Valerius, his advisor of 5 centuries, was expertly fending off the advances of a harpy-like baroness from the eastern fiefs. Duchess Seraphina was holding court near the blood fountain, her laughter like the shattering of fine crystal. And then his eyes stopped. Standing near a tapestry depicting the glorious and frankly embellished Battle of the Crimson Moor was a human. This was not unusual. Human dignitaries and specialists were sometimes invited as a show of magnanimous tolerance. But this one was different. She wasn't gawking. She wasn't trembling. She was holding a canapé she clearly had no intention of eating and looking at the tapestry with an expression of professional disdain. His hearing, sharp enough to isolate a whispered conversation 3 rooms away, locked onto her automatically. It was her heartbeat that had snagged him first, steady and unhurried in a room full of creatures that could drain her in seconds. Most humans at these events had pulses like frightened rabbits. Hers thumped along with the calm regularity of someone waiting for a bus. She was Delilah, a historical consultant the Human Vampire Cultural Accord insisted he employ for the restoration of the castle's western wing. He'd signed the paperwork without a glance. Now, seeing her, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he first learned to read. Curiosity. She turned to the woman beside her, another human scholar, and spoke. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a clear, crisp statement, meant only for her companion, but delivered with the casual volume of someone who had never had to worry about being overheard by creatures who could hear a pin drop in the next principality. "You know," Delilah said, gesturing vaguely toward the dais with her uneaten shrimp puff, "for a man who has lived 700 years, you'd think he'd have developed a personality beyond brooding statue. He's magnificently tailored, I'll grant you, but entirely overdressed and profoundly underinteresting." Ashton froze, which for a vampire who was already supernaturally still was a remarkable feat. It was less a freezing of the body and more a freezing of the mind. The chalice in his hand paused halfway to his lips. 3 ancient coven leaders standing nearby swiveled their heads in perfect, horrified unison. Lord Valerius from across the room looked as though he'd been struck by lightning. The scholar beside Delilah choked on her drink. "Delilah, for heaven's sake, he'll hear you," Delilah shrugged, finally abandoning the shrimp puff on a passing tray. "He's supposed to be terrifying. The least he could do is be interesting while he's at it. All that power and he uses it to perfect the art of standing still. It's a waste of good velvet. Ashton didn't move. His mind, a vast and ancient library of political strategy, battle tactics, and forgotten languages, went completely blank. For 7 centuries, he had been feared, revered, desired, and obeyed. No one, not once, had ever looked upon him and found him dull. He raised the chalice to his lips and drank. The blood was room temperature, stored, clinical. It sustained him. It did not satisfy. It was the most astonishing thing that had ever happened to him. He was obsessed instantly. The next evening, which was how Ashton's world measured mornings, Lord Valerius found his king not in the strategy room or the royal study, but in the archives, frantically pulling out scrolls. "Your Majesty?" Valerius ventured, his voice betraying the exhaustion of someone who had been awake for 500 consecutive years and was really feeling it today. "Is there a crisis? An insurrection? Did the Shadow Syndicate declare war again? Their paperwork is always a nightmare." Ashton didn't look up. He was staring at a personnel file, his pale fingers turning the pages with a delicacy that could just as easily have crushed the desk beneath them. He was utterly still, except for his hands. No breath, no blinking, just the soft whisper of paper. Delilah Vance, human, historical consultant, specializes in pre-Renaissance architecture and textiles. Commendations for her work on the restoration of Château de Brissac. Notes here say she is forthright. Valerius blinked slowly. "Yes, my king. The human from the Accord. She's overseeing the stonework analysis in the West Wing. Is there a problem with her work?" "A problem?" Ashton looked up, his eyes alight with a terrifying, unfamiliar fire. In the candlelight, his irises caught the flame and held it, the ancient predator's gaze that had made grown men weep with terror. Right now, it was directed at the concept of modern courtship. "No problem. Valerius, what do modern human women find interesting?" Valerius felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with his ambient body temperature. "Sire, I'm not certain I'm qualified to." "Poetry?" Ashton mused, already moving past him. He crossed the archive in 3 strides that covered ground no human stride should have managed, his cloak settling a full second after the rest of him had stopped. "Is that still a thing? Or is it gifts? Precious metals? Perhaps a title? A small, tastefully haunted duchy?" "My king," Valerius said, hurrying to keep up as Ashton swept through the corridors. The torches guttered in his wake, the air displaced by a vampire moving at speed but pretending not to. "Might I suggest a more subtle approach? The subject of your interest is, after all, human. They are fragile, easily startled." "She didn't seem startled last night," Ashton murmured, a strange, almost smile playing on his lips. "It looked unpracticed, like a muscle he hadn't used in decades. She seemed bored. We must rectify this immediately." Valerius sighed. It was going to be a long century. Delilah noticed. Of course she noticed. The first sign was the flowers. An arrangement of black roses so vast it had to be brought in by 2 footmen appeared in her temporary quarters at the castle. The petals were the color of a bruise in moonlight, and the thorns had been removed with surgical precision, likely by someone who could move faster than the human eye could track. The card simply read, A. Beatrice, her assigned maid, a fledgling vampire who still seemed perpetually surprised by everything, including her own lack of a pulse, stared at them with wide, reverent eyes. "These are midnight blooms from the royal greenhouse, miss. They only blossom on a blood moon. They say the king cultivates them himself." Delilah sniffed one. It smelled like expensive dirt and something faintly metallic, like old copper. "They're lovely, Beatrice. They'd look wonderful in your room." Beatrice gasped. "Oh, no, miss! I couldn't! They're from the king!" "And I'm giving them to you," Delilah said cheerfully, turning back to her blueprints. "Waste not, want not." She paused, her pen hovering over the West Wing's floor plan. The flowers were beautiful. And the gesture was, she had to admit, strangely sweet for a creature who could hear her heartbeat from across a banquet hall and probably smelled her blood the way she smelled fresh coffee. The thought should have been unsettling. She filed it under Times, Think About Later Times, and went back to her mortar analysis. The second sign was the coincidental meetings. She was examining the Gothic arches in the Grand Hall, her measuring tape stretched between two pillars when the temperature dropped. It was subtle, like stepping into the shadow of a building on a summer day. Except there was no sun here. There hadn't been sun in this part of the castle for centuries, by design. She looked up. Ashton was standing 6 feet away, close enough that she should have heard him approach, and hadn't. No footsteps, no rustle of fabric, no breath. He had simply materialized from the shadows like a very well-dressed patch of darkness. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that had probably caused legions to swoon. "I was just passing through." Delilah didn't look up from her measuring tape. Her heart, she was annoyed to note, had ticked up slightly. She was certain he'd noticed. "Vampires always noticed. This is the Grand Hall, Your Majesty. It's the only way to get to half the castle. Everyone passes through here. It's sort of its primary function." There was a pause. She could feel his confusion. It was a palpable thing, like static in the air, and it was accompanied by that utter, inhuman stillness. He stood the way no living thing stood, without shifting, without breathing, his weight perfectly distributed as if gravity were a suggestion. He was politely declining. "Indeed," he finally said. "I see you are hard at work." "I am." She made a note on her clipboard, acutely aware that his gaze hadn't wavered from her face. Vampires didn't do the polite dance of looking away and back. They looked, and they kept looking, with the focused intensity of a creature that had spent centuries learning patience. The structural integrity of this arch is questionable. It was clearly repaired after the siege of 1482, but they used inferior mortar. Typical. "I was there for that siege," Ashton said, a hint of pride in his voice. "I led the final charge myself." "Then you should have paid more attention to the masons you hired afterward," she replied without missing a beat. "This whole section will need to be reinforced." "It's a death trap." She caught herself. "Well, a death trap for me anyway. I imagine you'd just walk it off." Something shifted in his expression. It was barely perceptible, a faint crack in the marble of his composure. "I would survive the collapse," he agreed, his voice careful. "You would not." The words hung between them, weighted with something she couldn't quite name. "The work to reinforce this section will begin immediately." She finally looked up at him. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, his dark eyes reflecting the torchlight with an intensity that was decidedly not human. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him, completely and utterly baffled. It was, she decided, a significant improvement on brooding statue. A slow smile spread across her face as she turned back to the wall. Oh, this was going to be fun. The third sign, and the one that cemented her little game, was the poetry. A slim, leather-bound book was left on her desk. The leather was old, hand-tooled, the kind of craftsmanship that predated industrial manufacturing by several centuries. Inside, on elegant parchment, was a sonnet. It was written in a flawless, archaic script, full of metaphors about endless nights, singular stars, and the pallor of the moon. It was technically brilliant, emotionally overwrought, and signed, with a dramatic flourish, A. Delilah read it twice, the first time for content, the second for comedic value. The metaphors were lovely if you ignored that endless night was less poetic romance and more literal job description for a vampire. She suspected he hadn't noticed the irony. Then she tucked it neatly into the dense academic text she was reading, load-bearing walls in late Gothic architecture. It made for an excellent bookmark. A few nights later, at a small, formal gathering to review the restoration's progress, she saw him watching her. He was standing with Lord Valerius, pretending to be engaged in a serious conversation, but his eyes were fixed on her with that unblinking, predatory focus that vampires couldn't seem to turn off. He held his goblet of blood without drinking, without moving, a statue in velvet that happened to be staring at her with the intensity of someone trying to will a book to open. She was seated in a comfortable chair by the fire, The warmth of it, a small luxury she didn't take for granted in a castle that was, climatically speaking, optimized for the dead. She lifted her book, opened it to her page, and let the leather-bound volume of poetry dangle conspicuously for a moment before tucking it back inside. Across the room, Ashton choked on his blood. Valerius, with the practiced ease of a man who had seen everything, smoothly thumped his king on the back. Delilah saw the exact moment Ashton's brain processed the scene. His regal composure, honed over 7 centuries, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. His expression shifted from hopeful expectation to abject horror, then to a sort of wounded disbelief. He knew that she knew. Delilah hid her triumphant grin behind her book. The chase, she thought, was always so much more satisfying than the catch, and the king of the vampires, it turned out, was a delightfully clumsy hunter. "She is using my soul's lament as a placeholder," Ashton stated, pacing the length of his study. The room was a testament to his age and power. Towering shelves filled with first editions, maps of forgotten kingdoms, and a fireplace large enough to roast a bear, which he hadn't used for centuries because the heat was vaguely unpleasant. The cold suited him. Cold suited all of them. He paced without sound. His feet touched the stone floor, but made no noise, as if the ground were embarrassed to announce his passing. The candles in the room flickered not from a breeze, but from the displaced air of a body moving faster than it appeared to. Valerius stood by the desk, massaging the bridge of his nose. "A bookmark, Your Majesty. I believe the common term is bookmark. It is a calculated act of psychological warfare." Ashton spun around, his black cloak flaring dramatically. He'd perfected the move in the 1600s, and it had never failed to intimidate. Until now. "She scorns my offerings. She ignores my presence. She uses my poetry to mark a chapter on buttresses." "Perhaps," Valerius suggested gently, "the lady is simply not interested in courtship." "Impossible." Ashton scoffed, though a flicker of doubt crossed his features. "I am a king. I am immortal. I have been described in historical texts as imposing and terribly majestic." "The texts you commissioned yourself, sire," Valerius reminded him. Ashton waved a dismissive hand. "Details. No, this is a challenge. She requires a grander gesture, something undeniable." Valerius's soul withered a little more. "Majesty, please. The last time you made a grand gesture for that Viennese countess, we had to diplomatically annex half of Austria to smooth things over. May I propose something smaller? More modern? I am told humans now communicate via small, glowing rectangles." Ashton stopped pacing. He stood perfectly, inhumanly still, processing this information with the focus of a 700-year-old mind encountering a new variable. "Tell me more of these glowing rectangles." The next evening, Delilah was in the dusty, neglected castle archives. She'd been granted access as part of her work, and it was a historian's paradise. Centuries of documents, letters, and records lay in towering, disorganized piles. The air smelled of old vellum and foxed paper, and the only light came from the oil lamps she'd brought herself. The vampires, of course, didn't need them. They could read in the dark, which explained why the archive's lighting budget had been zero for approximately 400 years. She was carefully unrolling a charter from the 13th century when she heard a series of loud, frustrated noises from the far end of the aisle. It sounded like someone trying to fight a small, angry badger. Curious, she peered around a stack of tax ledgers. It was Ashton. He was holding a smartphone, one of the high-end models the castle staff used, and was stabbing at the screen with a single, elegant finger. He held it at arm's length, squinting at it as if it were a particularly insulting piece of modern art. The screen's glow cast a bluish light on his pale face, making him look even less human than usual. A marble statue illuminated by something it fundamentally did not understand. "Work, you damnable contraption," he hissed at it. "Connect to the Wi-Fi." He pronounced the word like a foreign curse. Delilah leaned against the bookshelf, crossing her arms. "Having trouble?" He looked up, startled. The speed of his reaction was inhuman. One moment he was glaring at the phone, the next his head had snapped toward her, shoulder-length hair swinging with the motion, his dark eyes wide. The phone hidden behind his back in a movement so fast her brain registered it as a jump cut rather than a motion. The predator reflex, she realized. Even embarrassed, he moved like something designed to hunt. Miss Vance, I was merely inspecting this device, for security purposes. Right, she said, a laugh in her voice. The security of the castle rests on your ability to conquer angry birds. Let me see. He hesitated, then reluctantly handed it over. His fingers brushed hers in the exchange, and the cold of his skin was startling, like touching a window in January. She'd known, intellectually, that vampires ran cold, feeling it was different. His hand was the temperature of stone in a cellar, smooth and dry, and utterly devoid of the warmth that made a person feel alive. It refuses to obey me, he said stiffly. Delilah took the phone, her fingertips still tingling from the contact. The screen was covered in a chaotic jumble of opened apps and settings menus. He had somehow managed to change the language to Cyrillic and turn on every accessibility feature simultaneously. The phone was now speaking its every action in a monotone Bulgarian accent. What exactly were you trying to do? She asked, her fingers flying across the screen, closing windows, switching the language back, and silencing the robotic voice. I was attempting to send a missive, he said stiffly. Lord Valerius informed me this is the preferred method of modern communication. You mean a text message? She found the messaging app he'd been trying to use. There was a single unsent draft addressed to her. It read, Dearest Miss Vance, prithee, attend me this eve. We shall partake of. The rest was an incoherent string of emojis that he had clearly selected at random. A skull, a frog, a rocket ship, an eggplant. Delilah felt a genuine, honest-to-goodness laugh bubble up and escape. It was loud and uninhibited in the quiet of the archives, and she watched his head tilt fractionally at the sound. He was listening, she realized. Not just hearing her laugh, but listening to it, cataloging it, the way a vampire cataloged every sensory detail about the things that interested them. Ashton stared at her, his usual bafflement warring with a new expression, profound embarrassment. He had faced down armies, he had negotiated treaties that shaped nations, and he had just been defeated by an eggplant emoji. I see, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You find my efforts amusing. She sobered, but the smile wouldn't leave her eyes. I find your efforts unexpected. Your Majesty, if you want to ask me to dinner, you could just ask me to dinner. He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. In the lamplight they were almost black, with a depth that suggested they had been watching the world for a very, very long time. Very well. Miss Vance, Delilah, would you do me the honor of dining with me this evening? She pretended to consider it, tapping a finger on her chin. I suppose I could clear my schedule of reading about buttresses. A slow, reluctant smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing centuries of regal severity and revealing something younger, something almost hopeful. The smile didn't reach his eyes the way a human smile did, she noticed. The warmth was there, but the eyes remained ancient, as if his face could perform joy, but his gaze could never quite forget what it had seen. I would be in your debt. Just dinner, Your Majesty, she said, handing him back his now functional phone. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. As she walked away, she heard him mutter to himself. She smiled. Valerius, the glowing rectangle worked. Delilah shook her head, grinning. He was as subtle as a thunderstorm and twice as entertaining. The dinner was an exercise in magnificent, hilarious absurdity. Ashton had clearly pulled out all the stops. They were in one of the smaller, more intimate dining halls, a room decorated with Flemish tapestries and lit by 1,000 candles that flickered in a non-existent breeze. The room was warm, she realized, unusually so for the castle. He had ordered the fireplaces lit for her. The vampires would have found it stifling. He was enduring it without complaint, though she noticed he had positioned his chair as far from the hearth as the table allowed. The table was laden with a feast that could have fed a small village. There was roasted pheasant, a whole salmon baked in pastry, glistening fruits, and desserts that looked like architectural marvels. Delilah, dressed in a simple but elegant dark green dress, felt absurdly out of place, and yet completely in her element. She sat at one end of a comically long table. Ashton sat at the other. The distance between them was approximately the length of a tennis court. His face was a pale moon at the far end, perfectly lit by candles that he did not need to see by. "Is this all for me?" she asked, gesturing at the mountain of food. "I was not certain of your preferences," Ashton said, his voice carrying effortlessly, not raised but simply projected with a precision that 700 years of commanding armies tended to develop. "So I instructed the kitchens to prepare everything." "Right." Delilah picked up a silver fork. "And what about you? Aren't you eating?" He had a single ornate goblet in front of him, filled with the usual crimson liquid. The smell of it reached her faintly, copper and iron and something darker, like wet earth after rain. "I have already partaken." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She knew he couldn't eat food. He knew she knew. But the pretense was part of the ridiculous dance they were engaged in. A servant materialized and placed a plate of pheasant in front of her. It was delicious. She took a bite, savoring it. Ashton watched her with an intensity that would have been unsettling if she hadn't already grown accustomed to the way vampires watched things. It wasn't rudeness. It was simply how they were built, all focus, all attention, all the time. "Is it palatable?" he asked, as if she were a food critic judging his very soul. "It's pheasant, Your Majesty. It tastes like chicken, but more expensive. It's very good." "Ah, excellent." He leaned forward slightly, the movement so controlled it looked deliberate rather than instinctive. "I recall pheasant from my youth. It was often served at my father's table, though we tended to roast it with saffron and cloves, a recipe brought back from the Crusades. Does this one have cloves?" "I'm not getting any cloves," she said after another bite. "Mostly thyme and butter." "Butter," he mused, the words sounding alien on his tongue. He looked at his goblet, then back at her plate. "I remember butter. The churning, it was a lengthy process. We kept the churns in the coldest part of the cellars." He paused. "I have not tasted food in 600 years. The body accepts it, but it sits like stone. There is no pleasure in it, only the memory of pleasure." The admission was quiet, almost accidental, as if the memory had slipped past his defenses. Delilah lowered her fork. For a moment, the comedy of the evening, the absurd feast, the tennis court table, the lone goblet of blood, resolved into something sharp and sad, 600 years without tasting butter. "Tell me about your work," he said, changing the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been redirecting conversations since before the printing press. "What do you find so fascinating about crumbling stone and faded cloth?" "It's not crumbling stone," she corrected him gently. "It's a story. Every chisel mark, every faded pigment, tells you something about the people who made it. Their lives, their beliefs, what they thought was important. This castle, it's the longest, most complicated story I've ever read." He considered this. "I have never thought of it that way. To me, it is simply home. A home where you led a charge in the siege of 1482, she pointed out. A home where you entertained kings and plotted against empires. You're not just living in the story, you're a main character. And you are the one who has come to read it," he said, his gaze locking with hers across the table. The candlelight danced in his dark eyes, and in that light, for just a moment, she could see the centuries in them, layered like sediment in rock. "What have you read about me so far, Delilah?" The shift from Times Miss Vance Times to Times Delilah Times was not lost on her. "I've read," she said slowly, "that you are a man of grand gestures, poetry, feasts, midnight roses." "And these gestures do not impress you?" he asked, a genuine note of vulnerability in his voice. "They're a bit archaic," she admitted. "It feels like you're courting a medieval princess, not a 21st century historian." His face fell. "I see," My methods are outdated. I didn't say I disliked them, she added quickly, surprising herself. I just said they were archaic. There's a certain charm to it. It's like finding a perfectly preserved manuscript. It's not practical, but you have to admire the craftsmanship. A slow smile returned to his face. So I am a well-made manuscript? Covered in dramatic flourishes and probably in need of careful handling, she quipped. His smile widened into a genuine grin. It was a rare, dazzling sight, and she noticed, with the observational precision of her profession, that his canine teeth were slightly longer than a human's. Not the dramatic fangs of horror movies, just slightly, subtly wrong, the way everything about him was slightly, subtly wrong. I believe I can live with that assessment, he said. What happened next was not planned. It was not a grand gesture or a calculated move. It was the sort of thing that happens when two people stop performing for each other, even just for a moment. The servants had cleared the plates. Delilah had eaten her fill and was cradling a glass of wine that was, she suspected, older than most democracies. Ashton had his goblet, nearly untouched. The comically long table stretched between them, and the absurdity of it finally got to her. This is ridiculous, she said. He looked up, startled. I beg your pardon? The table. I feel like I need a megaphone, or binoculars. She stood, picked up her wineglass, and walked the full length of the table. His eyes tracked her the entire way, his head turning slowly, his body otherwise motionless. She pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Up close, the candlelight revealed what distance had hidden, the preternatural smoothness of his skin, the absolute stillness of his chest, no breath, no rise and fall, the faint blue veins visible at his temples, carrying blood that wasn't his own, and his eyes, up close, were not simply dark. They were layered, black over brown over something older, like looking into water that was deeper than it appeared. He had gone very, very still, stiller than his usual stillness, which was saying something. She could feel the cold radiating off him, a gentle ambient chill, like sitting near an open window in autumn. There, she said, setting her glass down. Now we can have a conversation without a postal service. He didn't speak for a moment. She realized with a small shock that he was nervous. The king of the onyx throne, lord of the 7 nocturnes, was nervous because she had moved her chair. You are, he started and stopped. Started again. Delilah, you must understand. I am not accustomed to proximity. You stood 6 feet away from me in the grand hall without warning. That is different. That is approaching. This is. He looked at her sitting beside him, her warmth close enough that he could feel it on his skin, the beat of her heart a drum he could feel in his chest. This is staying. She didn't have a clever response for that. She wanted one. She always had one. But the rawness of the admission, the way he'd said times staying times, like it was a word he'd forgotten how to use, short-circuited her wit. Tell me something, she said instead, her voice softer than she intended. Something real, not a grand gesture or a sonnet, something you've never told a room full of courtiers. He was quiet for a long time. A human would have filled the silence. He let it be. I miss warmth, he said finally. His voice was low, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his own hands, pale and still on the dark wood of the table. I have been cold for 700 years. Not uncomfortable, simply cold. It is the absence of a thing you stop noticing until someone warm sits beside you. He turned his head and looked at her. You are very warm, Delilah. It wasn't a line. It wasn't poetry. It was a man telling her, in the only way he knew how, that her presence changed the temperature of his world. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. His skin was cool marble under her palm, smooth and hard and utterly devoid of the give that living skin had. She felt his fingers twitch beneath hers, a fractional movement, as if the contact had startled him at a level deeper than reflex. Is this all right? She asked. He looked down at their hands, her warm brown skin against his pale, cold fingers, the color difference, the temperature difference, two entirely different kinds of alive, touching at the borders. Yes, he said, and his voice cracked on the word, a 700-year-old voice, cracking like a boy's. He turned his hand over beneath hers, slowly, carefully, and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was impossibly gentle, the deliberate softness of something that could crush bone. It is the most all right a thing has been in a very long time. They sat like that, in the quiet of the candlelit room, their hands intertwined on the dark table. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. The fire crackled. Her heart beat. His didn't. After a while, she felt his thumb move, slowly, tracing a line across her knuckles, back and forth. Learning the geography of her hand the way she'd seen him study ancient maps, with patience and reverence and the quiet understanding that the territory was precious. "Your hands are warm," he said softly, almost to himself. I had forgotten what warm hands felt like. 700 years is a long time to go without holding someone's hand, she said. It is, he looked at her. The vulnerability in his face was staggering, naked and unprotected, in a way that 7 centuries of kingship should have made impossible. I have begun to realize that it is possible to be surrounded by a court for 700 years and to have been alone for every one of them. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back, with the barest pressure, as if she were made of spun glass. "Well," she said, and her voice was thicker than she wanted it to be, "you're not alone tonight." As she was leaving, he pressed a small velvet box into her hands. She opened it later in her room. It wasn't a jewel. It wasn't a deed to a duchy. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages blank. Tucked inside the front cover was a modern, high-quality fountain pen. A note, in his perfect script, read, "For the rest of the story." Delilah sat on her bed, the journal in her hands. The memory of his cold fingers laced through hers still ghosting on her skin. She pressed her own hand flat against her chest and felt her heart beat, strong and steady and finite. He had given her something blank, something to fill, something with a future. And his future was very, very long. Hers was not. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, and for the first time since arriving at the castle, she didn't fall asleep easily. The news of the king's human fancy spread through the court like a plague. Whispers followed Delilah down corridors. Ancient vampires would pause their conversations to stare at her as she passed, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. She felt their gazes like physical weight, that predatory attention, dozens of eyes tracking her heartbeat, her warmth, her fragile mortality through halls of cold stone. The undisputed queen of the hostile faction was Duchess Seraphina, a vampire of formidable age and even more formidable hauteur. She had considered herself the frontrunner for the position of queen for the better part of 3 centuries. Delilah's presence was not just an insult. It was a personal affront to her entire existence. She cornered Delilah in the castle library, a magnificent 2-story rotunda where the air smelled of aging paper and leather. Delilah was perched on a rolling ladder, examining the spines of books on the upper level. "Miss Vance," Seraphina said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. She was flanked by 2 equally disdainful-looking vampire ladies-in-waiting. All 3 of them stood with that same uncanny stillness, like a tableau of beautiful, hostile statuary. Delilah looked down from her perch. "Duchess, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I confess, we are all so intrigued by you," Seraphina said, gliding closer. The word times, gliding times, was not metaphorical. Vampires moved without the mechanical rhythm of walking. They simply relocated, smooth and silent. "Tell me, what is it that a mortal finds to do with her time in a place like this? It must be so dreadfully dull for you, with the sun being so inconveniently present during the day." "I manage," Delilah said dryly. "I read. I work. I enjoy the novelty of having a pulse. You'd be surprised how time flies when you're not facing down an eternity of it." Seraphina's painted smile tightened. "How quaint! But surely you must feel out of your depth. We are creatures of power. of history. You are a fleeting footnote. The word times, fleeting times, landed harder than Delilah expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She was fleeting, by their standards, a mayfly, in a room full of oaks. The thought connected to the one that had kept her up last night, holding her own pulse in the dark. She pushed it down and smiled. Funny, that's what the last remnants of the Roman Empire probably said about the Visigoths. History has a way of turning footnotes into headlines, Duchess. You should read up on it. There are several excellent books on the subject right here. She patted a large tome titled Times, The Inevitable Decline of Stagnant Empires. One of the ladies-in-waiting gasped. Seraphina's eyes narrowed into slits. You are impertinent, she hissed. The king may be momentarily amused by his little pet historian, but do not mistake a passing diversion for a permanent position. He will tire of you, as he tires of all his novelties. And you, unlike his other diversions, will have the added misfortune of growing old while he watches. The cruelty of it was precise, because it was honest. Delilah opened her mouth to retort, and found, for the first time, that she had nothing clever to say. The image arrived fully formed, herself at 40, 50, 60, standing next to a face that hadn't changed in 7 centuries. Her hair going gray, her skin softening. And him exactly the same, watching the clock of her body wind down. That is quite enough, Duchess. Ashton's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. He emerged from the shadows between 2 towering bookshelves, and Times emerged. Times was the right word, because he hadn't been walking toward them. He had simply appeared, a phantom in black velvet who moved without displacing air or making sound. The temperature in the library dropped, and Delilah realized it wasn't the room, it was him. His presence radiated cold the way a furnace radiated heat, and when he was angry, the chill intensified. Seraphina and her friends froze, their haughty expressions melting into ones of pure, primal fear. This was what 7 centuries of unbroken rule looked like from below, not a man, but a force. Your Majesty, Seraphina stammered, executing a flawless, trembling curtsy. We were just welcoming Miss Vance. My ears, which are considerably sharper than yours, suggest otherwise, Ashton said, his voice dangerously soft. He came to a stop at the base of the ladder, placing a hand on it and looking up at Delilah. His expression was unreadable, that vampiric control locked down tight, but his eyes burned with a cold fury she hadn't seen before. Not toward her, toward the ones who had tried to diminish her. Delilah is my guest, and she is the foremost expert on the preservation of this castle's history. A history, I might add, that you and your ilk have shown precious little interest in, beyond which tapestries best hide bloodstains. You will treat her with the respect her position and my favor demands. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The authority in his words was absolute, a crushing weight that left no room for argument. Of course, Your Majesty, Seraphina whispered, her face pale even by vampire standards. See that it does not happen again, he said, his eyes never leaving Delilah. It was a dismissal. Seraphina and her entourage practically vaporized, scurrying out of the library with a haste that was anything but dignified. Silence descended. Delilah remained on the ladder, looking down at him. He was still holding on to it, his long, pale fingers wrapped around the wood, and she could see now that the wood beneath his grip was slightly compressed. He was holding on too hard, controlling himself. Thank you, she said quietly. She was insulting you, he stated, as if it were the most obvious crime in the world. I've been called worse. Not in my home, he said, the finality in his tone sending a shiver down her spine. And not while I am here to prevent it. She started to climb down the ladder. As her feet reached the last few rungs, he stepped forward, offering a hand to steady her. His skin was cold, as she'd expected, familiar now. She stepped onto the floor, but he didn't let go of her hand. His fingers were cool and smooth and entirely still around hers. No fidgeting, no adjustment. He held her hand the way he did everything, with absolute, focused certainty. They stood there, inches apart, in the silent, book-filled library, and she could see the question in his eyes, the one Serafina had planted, the one he'd heard every word of and couldn't unknow. "You heard all of it," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." "The part about growing old." "Yes." His hand tightened fractionally around hers. "Delilah, is she right?" The words came out before she could stop them. Stripped of wit, stripped of armor. Just a woman standing in front of a creature who would look exactly the same in 300 years, asking the thing that had kept her up at night. "Will you get bored? When the novelty wears off? When I'm—" "Don't." His voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. He was looking at her hand in his, at the warm, living skin against his cold fingers, and his face held an expression she had never seen on him before. Not bafflement, not regal composure, pain. Old, deep, structural pain. The kind that lived in the foundations. "Don't finish that sentence." "I have to," she said, and her voice didn't break, but it wanted to. "Because you're going to look like this when I'm 70, and 80, and when I'm gone. And I need to know that you've thought about that." He was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of all the courtly polish. "I have thought about nothing else since the night you called me underinteresting," he said. "Every moment I spend with you, I am aware that your heart is beating, that it will beat a finite number of times, that I will hear it slow, someday, and stop." He swallowed, and the gesture was strange on him, unnecessary, a human reflex surfacing under emotional strain. "I have lived 700 years, Delilah. I have watched empires rise and crumble. I have buried friends and enemies and watched the world remake itself a dozen times over. And I can tell you, with the certainty of someone who has wasted centuries standing still, that a single year of being seen by you would be worth more than the 700 that came before." The library was silent except for the distant hiss of candles. "You're going to suffer," she whispered. "After." "Yes," he said simply. "I am." "That doesn't scare you?" He looked at her, and his ancient eyes were bright with something fierce and tender and terrifying. "I have been numb for 7 centuries. The suffering will mean I was alive. You will have done that. You will have made a 700-year-old dead thing feel alive. Do not ask me to be afraid of the cost." She couldn't speak. Her throat was closed, and her eyes were burning. And she was a professional historian who prided herself on her composure. And she was about to cry in a vampire's library because an immortal king had just told her that her finite heartbeat was the most valuable sound in his endless existence. He reached up, slowly, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The cold of his touch against the warmth of her skin was electric. His hand lingered, cradling her face. "I understand," he said gently. "If this is too much, if the cost frightens you, you are mortal. You are allowed to choose a simpler life, with someone whose timeline matches yours." "I would not." He paused, his jaw tightened. "I would not blame you." She put her hand over his where it rested on her cheek, his cold hand, her warm hand, the same geography they'd mapped at the dinner table. "You'd let me go?" "It would destroy me," he said, with the calm honesty of someone stating a fact about the weather. "But yes, if it was what you wanted." She looked at him. The ancient king with the cracked voice and the careful hands, and the centuries of loneliness sitting behind his eyes. And she realized something that she should have known from the moment she'd called him underinteresting, and he'd frozen like a man hit by lightning. She wasn't afraid of the cost. She was afraid of not paying it. "You're not getting rid of me that easily," she said, and her voice was rough and wet and utterly without defense. "You ridiculous, overdressed 700-year-old disaster." The sound he made was not a laugh and not a sob. It was somewhere in between, a sound she suspected he hadn't made in centuries. He pulled her against him, wrapped his arms around her, and held her with the desperate, trembling restraint of something infinitely strong trying to be infinitely gentle. She pressed her face into his chest and felt the absence of a heartbeat, the cool stillness where a pulse should have been, and she held on tighter. They stood in the library, wrapped around each other, her warmth bleeding into his cold seeping into her warmth, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left that words could do that this couldn't do better. After the library, things changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of grand gestures or public declarations. In smaller ways, quieter ones, the kind that mattered more. Ashton started appearing in the West Wing while she worked. Not with excuses this time. He would simply arrive, silent as always, and sit in the corner of whatever room she was analyzing. He brought his correspondence with him, thick stacks of parchment sealed with blood-red wax, and he would read and sign documents while she measured walls and cataloged stonework. They didn't always talk. Sometimes an hour would pass in companionable silence, her scraping mortar samples, him scratching his signature on decrees in an ancient hand that hadn't changed since the 14th century. It was the silence that undid her. She was accustomed to his comedy, his bafflement, his dramatic flourishes. She was not accustomed to the quiet version of him. The one who sat without fidgeting, without breathing, utterly still except for the movement of his pen, and who looked up every few minutes to watch her, not with the hungry intensity of the grand dinner, with something softer, something patient, as if watching her work was simply where he wanted to be. One evening she was balanced on a scaffolding platform, photographing a faded fresco on the vaulted ceiling when she wobbled. It wasn't a serious stumble. She caught herself on the railing. But in the fraction of a second between the wobble and the catch, Ashton was on his feet and at the base of the scaffolding, one hand braced on the frame, his eyes sharp. He had crossed 20 feet of room in the time it took her to blink. "I'm fine," she said, looking down at him. He didn't move. His hand remained on the scaffolding, knuckles white. His face was controlled, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his stillness had changed from relaxed to coiled. The predator in him, the part that catalogued every threat in every room, had registered her stumble as danger and responded before his conscious mind had caught up. "I'm times fine, Ashton." He exhaled, a deliberate, unnecessary thing. "I am aware. I would simply prefer it if you did not fall." From 6 feet? From any height. He released the scaffolding, and she saw the indentations his fingers had left in the metal frame. He looked at the damage, then at her, with an expression that was half embarrassment and half something deeper. "I forget, sometimes, how little it would take." She climbed down from the scaffolding, walked over to him, and without preamble, took his hand. He let her. She turned it over, ran her thumb across his unmarked palm, the skin cool and smooth and impossibly durable, no calluses, no scars. A hand that had held swords and signed treaties and crushed enemies and, more recently, struggled with a smartphone. "These hands," she said, tracing the lines of his palm with her fingertip, "have done terrible things, haven't they?" "Yes," he said quietly. He didn't flinch from it. He didn't dress it up. "And they just put dents in a steel scaffolding pole because I wobbled." "Yes." She looked up at him. "You're terrified of hurting me." It wasn't a question, and he didn't treat it like one. "It is the thing I am most afraid of in this world," he said. "More than sunlight, more than the stake. You are the most fragile thing I have ever held, and I am the most dangerous thing that has ever held you." She lifted his hand and pressed her lips to his cold palm. He went utterly still, and she felt a tremor run through him, fine and deep, like a vibration in stone. When she looked up, his eyes were closed. "Delilah," he whispered. "You won't break me," she said against his skin. "I'm sturdier than I look." "You are the sturdiest person I have ever met," he said, and his voice was full of wonder. "And you are made of paper and sunlight and 70 years of borrowed time. And I am made of stone and night, and I have never been more frightened in my life." She kissed his palm again, and this time his fingers curled around hers, gently, so gently, and held on. The first time she saw him hungry, she understood. She'd stayed late in the archives, losing track of time in a cache of 15th century household records. When she emerged, the corridors were darker than usual. The candles guttered low, and the castle felt different, tenser, like the stones themselves were holding their breath. She found him in his study. He was standing at the window, his back to the door, his posture rigid. The room was cold, even for the castle, and she could see that he was gripping the stone window ledge hard enough that thin cracks radiated from beneath his fingers. Ashton? He turned, and the sight of him stopped her in the doorway. He looked the same. Objectively, nothing had changed, but everything had changed. His eyes were darker, the pupils blown wide, and there was a sharpness to his features that hadn't been there before, as if the bones of his face were pressing closer to the surface. The control that defined him, that 700-year-old composure, was still in place, but she could see the effort of it now. He was holding himself in check the way a dam holds back water, visibly. "You should not be here," he said, and his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Low, tight, hungry. "You haven't fed," she said. He turned back to the window. "It is being attended to. A delivery from the city is expected before dawn." "When did you last?" 4 days ago. She processed this. Beatrice had mentioned in passing that the king typically fed every 2 days. 4 was pushing it. Why? He was quiet for a moment. The supply caravan was delayed. The northern roads are controlled by Malakor's sympathizers. It is a logistical matter. "You're starving." "I am uncomfortable," he corrected, and the word cost him something. She could hear it. "It is not the same thing. I have gone longer. I once went 3 weeks during the siege of—" He stopped, drew a breath he didn't need. "Delilah, I am asking you, with whatever remnant of courtesy I have left, to please leave this room." She didn't move. "Your blood," he said, and the words came out like they were being extracted from him, "is the loudest thing in this castle right now. I can hear it from here. I can hear it moving through your veins. I can smell it. The iron, the warmth, the—" He caught himself. His hands tightened on the ledge and a piece of stone crumbled to dust. "Please, go." She should have been afraid. Every rational part of her brain was telling her that she was alone in a room with a starving predator who could drain her in seconds, that the control he was famous for had a limit, and 4 days of hunger was testing it. Instead, she walked into the room and sat down in the chair by his desk. He made a sound that was very nearly a growl. "What are you doing?" "Sitting," she said. "You're not going to hurt me. You don't know that." "I do know that." She looked at him, his rigid back, his white-knuckled grip on the stone. "Because the man who dented a scaffolding pole when I stumbled is not going to lose control because his dinner is late. You're hungry. You're not a monster." He turned slowly. The look on his face was something she'd never seen before. Desperation and gratitude, and something raw and aching that had nothing to do with blood. "You should be afraid of me." "Probably," she agreed. "But you've been afraid of me since the night I called you underinteresting, so I figure we're even." The laugh that escaped him was ragged and pained and real. He crossed the room, not at vampire speed, at human speed, deliberately, carefully, and sank into the chair across from her. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Physically, he was a predator in his prime. But the hunger and the control were at war inside him, and the effort was written in the set of his shoulders. "Talk to me," he said, "about anything. The West Wing, the mortar, the buttresses, anything that is not the sound of your heart." So she did. She sat in his freezing study and talked to him about 13th century masonry techniques, about the particular shade of ochre used in the West Wing frescoes, about the handwriting analysis that proved his great-great-grandfather had been left-handed. She talked steadily and calmly while the most dangerous creature she had ever known sat across from her and focused on her voice instead of her blood. After an hour, his hands unclenched. After 2, his shoulders dropped. Somewhere around midnight, the supply caravan arrived. and Beatrice appeared at the door with a tray of sealed crystal decanters, the blood dark and rich behind the glass. Delilah stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "Ashton?" He looked up from the decanter he was holding, his eyes still too dark, still too sharp, but the wildness receding. "Thank you," he said, before she could speak, "for staying." "That seems to be our thing," she said. He smiled, and even hungry, even hollowed out, the smile was real. "Yes," he said, "it does." She left him to his meal. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the cold stone and counted her heartbeats until they slowed. She had not been afraid. She had been terrified. And she had stayed anyway. He found her 2 nights later, asleep in the archives. She'd fallen asleep at her work table, her head pillowed on her arm, surrounded by spread-out documents and her ever-present lamp. It was past midnight, deep in the hours that belonged to his kind. The archives were silent, except for the faint scratch of settling paper and the steady, slow rhythm of her breathing. Ashton stood in the doorway and watched her sleep. Her face was soft in the lamplight, unguarded in a way it never was when she was awake. Awake, Delilah was wit and armor and sharp angles. Asleep, she was just a woman. Small and warm and temporary, in a way that made his chest ache with a pain he didn't have a word for, in any of the 11 languages he spoke. He should wake her. The archives were cold, and she'd been sleeping on stone without a blanket, but he didn't, not yet. He stood in the doorway and listened to her breathe, counted the heartbeats, mapped the rhythm, memorized it the way he memorized everything, except that this was the first thing he had memorized in centuries that he knew he would lose. He moved quietly to her side and draped his coat over her shoulders. She stirred, mumbled something about lime mortar, and settled. His hand hovered above her hair, trembling slightly with the effort of not touching her. He could be so careful. But careful and safe were not the same thing, and he was never entirely sure, with her, where the line was. He pulled a chair to the edge of her work table and sat down. He did not need to sleep. He rarely wanted to. But he wanted to be near her, and if this was how she slept, in cold rooms surrounded by other people's histories, then this was where he would be. Around 3 a.m, she woke. She blinked, disoriented, and found him sitting beside her in the lamplight, his coat on her shoulders, reading one of her reference texts. "How long have you been here?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "A while," he said. "Were you watching me sleep?" "I was reading your book on Romanesque column classifications." He held it up. "It is remarkably tedious. I may have glanced at you occasionally for relief." She laughed, a sleep-soft, throaty sound that he filed away alongside every other laugh of hers he'd collected. She pulled his coat tighter around herself, and he watched the gesture with an expression he probably thought was neutral but was, in fact, nakedly adoring. "You're a strange man, Ashton." "I am not technically a man." "You're a strange whatever you are, then." He considered this. "I prefer well-made manuscript." She smiled and leaned her head against the high back of her chair, looking at him. The lamplight softened the angles of his face, and in the quiet of the archives, surrounded by the accumulated papers of his long life, he looked less like a king and more like someone she could know, really know. "Read to me," she said, "from the book. It is about column classifications." "I know. I like your voice." He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the focus of someone who had just been given a gift he hadn't expected. Then he opened the book and began to read, his voice low and measured and impossibly old, filling the cold room with the steady cadence of Romanesque architecture and the quiet, unspoken understanding that he would have read her the dictionary if she'd asked. She fell asleep again before he finished the second chapter. He kept reading anyway. "I have something I wish to show you," he said the next evening, "something no one has seen for 200 years. He led her through a series of winding corridors, down a stone staircase that seemed to descend into the very foundations of the castle. The air grew colder, stiller. She pulled her cardigan tighter. He noticed and, without a word, shrugged off his outer coat and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, soft, and carried no body heat whatsoever. It was like wrapping herself in a luxurious blanket that had been stored in a wine cellar. She pulled it closer anyway. It smelled faintly of old paper and cold stone, and something darker, something that was just him. He stopped before a massive iron-bound door with no visible handle or lock. "This was my father's observatory," he said. "He had a fascination with the stars. After his death, I sealed it. The memories were difficult." He placed his palm flat against the cold stone beside the door. Faint, silvery lines etched into the wall glowed with a soft light, tracing intricate patterns. The lock was old blood magic, the kind the vampire courts had used for millennia. His bloodline was the key. With a deep groan of ancient mechanisms, the stone door slid aside, revealing a circular room beyond. Delilah stepped inside and gasped. The room was a perfect circle, its ceiling a vast, domed mosaic of lapis lazuli and obsidian, inlaid with chips of diamond and silver that formed a precise, breathtaking map of the night sky as it had appeared 7 centuries ago. In the center of the room stood a massive, intricate astrolabe made of brass and polished steel. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. She could see the hand of a master, the precision of someone who had measured the stars with the patience only immortality could provide. But that wasn't what had made her gasp. The domed ceiling was alive. The diamond stars twinkled with a soft internal light, a product of the same ancient blood magic that had sealed the door, and the constellations slowly, imperceptibly, wheeled across the dark blue stone, mimicking the real movement of the heavens. It was a perfect, timeless night sky, captured forever in stone and precious metal. "It's beautiful," she breathed, walking to the center of the room and tilting her head back. "My father believed that by charting the stars, he could chart our destiny," Ashton said, his voice soft with memory. He stood near the door, watching her. In the blue light, his pale skin seemed to glow faintly, as if he belonged to this room in a way she never could. He was a dreamer, a scientist in an age of superstition. "What happened to him?" she asked gently. "He was killed by his own kind," Ashton replied. His voice went flat, emptied out, and she recognized it now. The vampiric tell. They didn't get louder when they hurt. They got stiller, quieter, smaller. They feared his knowledge. They thought his science was a form of dark magic that would expose us all. They called him a heretic and staked him at dawn. He looked at the star-dusted ceiling. "I was young then, barely a century old. I avenged him. The coven that murdered him ceased to exist within a fortnight. It was my first act as king. Act, king, act, king, 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 act, act, king, act, king, act, king, act, 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 king, act." Delilah was silent. She was seeing the layers of him now, the ancient grief and brutal pragmatism that formed the bedrock of his long existence. He wasn't just a king. He was the survivor of a tragedy that had shaped his entire reign. A century old and already an orphan, already a killer, already alone. "I have never brought anyone else here," he said, turning to face her. The light from the diamond stars cast soft shadows on his face, picking out the sharp angles of cheekbones that hadn't aged in 700 years. "Why me?" she asked. He walked toward her, slowly, human speed. When he reached her, he stopped and looked up at the turning sky with her. Standing side by side in the blue light, they were an impossible pair, the warm and the cold, the temporary and the eternal, their shadows overlapping on the stone floor. "Because you read stories in stone," he said, "and this room is the truest story I have. My father made these stars. I sealed this room and I have been carrying it, alone, ever since." "And you," he turned to her, "you are the first person who made me want to unseal it." She didn't have a witty reply. She didn't want one. She reached for his hand and he gave it to her, cold fingers curling around warm ones, and they stood together under his father's stars. "He would have liked you," Ashton said, after a long silence. "Yeah?" He appreciated people who said exactly what they meant. "He would have found you very funny. Unlike you, who finds me merely infuriating. I find you terrifying," he said, and the word was so honest that it barely qualified as a joke. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her that night at the dinner table, with the raw, unpracticed vulnerability of someone who had forgotten how to be vulnerable and was relearning it in real time. "You have more power over me than any army or coven or rival king. You make me foolish. You make me hopeful. You make me afraid in ways that 7 centuries of warfare never managed." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his cold mouth against her warm skin. "You are the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me, Delilah Vance." "Good," she whispered. "It's about time someone was." He laughed, soft and low, and pulled her closer. She went willingly, stepping into him, and his arms wrapped around her. She rested her head against his chest and heard the silence where his heartbeat should have been. The absence didn't unsettle her anymore. It was just part of him, part of the strange, ancient, beautiful geography of the man she was falling in love with. "Your heart is racing," he murmured into her hair. "You're holding me under a 700-year-old star map. My heart gets to race." "I like it," he said. "It is my favorite sound." They stood like that, wrapped in each other under the slow-turning stars. His chin rested on the top of her head. Her arms circled his waist. The room was cold and blue and timeless, and they were warm and complicated and very, very mortal. At least one of them was. She lifted her face from his chest. He looked down at her. And this time, nobody interrupted. The kiss was slow, not hesitant. Slow the way old things are slow, with the weight and patience of someone who had waited centuries for something worth waiting for. His lips were cold and smooth and careful, and when she parted hers, he made a sound, low and involuntary, a quiet, shattered breath that he didn't need but couldn't help. She kissed him deeper, rising on her toes, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, and he responded by pulling her closer, one hand buried in her hair, cradling the back of her head, the other flat against the small of her back, pressing her warmth into his cold. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. She was breathing hard. He wasn't breathing at all, but his eyes were closed and there was an expression on his face that she could only describe as undone. "I've wanted to do that," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "since the night you called me underinteresting." "That long?" "I am a patient man. I have simply never had anything worth being patient for." She kissed him again, softer this time, gentler, learning the architecture of his mouth the way she learned old buildings, with care and attention and the quiet thrill of discovering something no one else had bothered to look at closely. "We should go," she said eventually, "before I decide to live in this room." "You would be welcome," he said, and he meant it, and they both knew it. They climbed the staircase together, hand in hand, her warmth and his cold meeting at the point where their fingers intertwined. At the top, the first pale fingers of dawn were visible through the arrow-slit windows. Ashton stopped, and she felt him tense. "The sun," she said. "Yes." He looked at the growing light with the wary attention of something that had evolved to fear it. "I should retire before it reaches the upper corridors." She squeezed his hand. "Good night, Ashton." "Good morning, Delilah." He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to her wrist, where her pulse beat against his mouth, and held it there for a long moment. She felt her heart beat against his cold lips, and she knew he felt it too, counting the beats, measuring the time. Then he released her, and stepped back into the shadows, and the shadows took him, and she stood in the growing light, and pressed her fingers to her wrist where his kiss still lingered like frost. The crisis arrived 3 nights later. A rival baron from the northern wastes, a brutish upstart named Malachor with more ambition than sense, had decided to test the king's authority. He'd sent a handful of his shock troops, hulking, lesser vampires bred for battle, to make a mess of the castle's periphery. It was less an invasion and more a form of supernatural vandalism. Ashton handled it with terrifying efficiency. Delilah watched from a high balcony as he moved through the moonlit courtyard below. He was no longer the man who'd kissed her under the stars. He was something else entirely. He didn't run so much as flicker, covering impossible distances between one heartbeat of hers and the next. She counted her own pulse to time him. 3 heartbeats to cross the courtyard. 1 to close with the first intruder. Less than 1 to put him down. He didn't use weapons. He didn't need them. His speed was beyond tracking, his strength so disproportionate that the shock troops, each one twice the width of a normal man, were ragdolled like children's toys. She saw him catch one mid-lunge, stop the creature's momentum with a single hand, and fling it into a stone wall hard enough to crack the masonry. He moved through them like wind through wheat, silent, precise, and absolutely fundamentally inhuman. The fight was over in minutes, the intruders subdued and dragged away to the dungeons. When he returned, there wasn't a speck of dust on his velvet coat. He looked up at her on the balcony, his face grim. In the moonlight, his eyes were flat and reflective. Like a cat's, the last traces of the predator's focus fading as he looked at her. She watched him make the transition, not from anger to calm, but from hunter to man, and she saw how much effort the latter cost him. "You are not safe here," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly on the night air. "Not while my enemies see you as a weakness." She thought about the library, his hand around hers, the stars, the kiss, the word times, weakness times, sat wrong against all of that, like a false note in a piece of music she'd started to love. "I'm not a weakness," she said. "I'm a historian. I have a measuring tape and strong opinions about mortar. If your enemies can't handle that, it's their problem." He didn't smile. That scared her more than the fight had. The next few nights were tense. The castle was on high alert. Guards were doubled, vampire sentries posted on every approach. Ashton was consumed with matters of state, dealing with the fallout from Malicor's raid. He was distant, formal again. The man from the star room was gone, replaced by the monarch. She saw him at a distance during this period, standing in a corridor while she passed, and she noticed he tracked her unconsciously. His head turned as she walked by, following her movement the way a compass needle follows north, and she wasn't sure he even knew he was doing it, but he kept his distance. The king had reasserted himself over the man. He tried to make up for it with grand gestures. The grandest and most disastrous came a week later. He summoned her to the throne room. The entire court was assembled. Duchess Serafina was there, looking smug. Lord Valerius was there, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Ashton was on his throne, high-backed and ancient, carved from black stone that predated the castle itself. He looked every inch the powerful king. Candlelight threw his shadow long across the floor, and the shadow did not move. "Delilah Vance," he announced, his voice booming in the cavernous hall. "In recognition of your invaluable service to the crown, and as a token of my personal esteem, I bestow upon you the Duchy of Blackwood-Mire and all its accompanying titles and lands." He held up a heavy, ornate deed, sealed with his royal crest. A collective gasp went through the court. Serafina looked like she'd been slapped. Delilah just stared at him. Blackwood-Mire? She'd read about it in the archives. It was a perpetually gloomy, haunted swamp, 300 miles north. Its primary exports were misery and bog moss. He thought this was what she wanted? A title? A swamp? After the library? After the stars? After she'd sat with him while he starved? After he'd read her to sleep in the archives? After he'd kissed her wrist at dawn and counted her heartbeats against his lips? He was standing on a throne and offering her a time swamp? He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing a problem to be solved. She was mortal, and mortals were fragile, and fragile things needed to be wrapped in titles and power and protection. He was trying to make her permanent in a world where she was, by every biological measure, temporary. It was the only solution his 700-year-old mind could find when the king took over from the man. The hurt was sharp and immediate. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The silence in the throne room was absolute. Ashton's regal facade faltered. I beg your pardon? I don't want a duchy, she said, her voice gaining strength. I am not one of your subjects to be rewarded, your majesty. I am a consultant. My work here is almost done. I'll be sending you my final invoice. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the throne room, leaving a king, a court, and the deed to a haunted swamp in stunned silence behind her. She packed her bags in a cold fury. Beatrice, the maid, fluttered around her, wringing her hands. Miss, you can't leave! The king, he didn't mean… He meant to put me in a box, Delilah said, snapping her suitcase shut. A very fancy, titled, swampy box. He thinks he can buy my safety, or my affection. He thinks he can solve this by throwing a duchy at me. He doesn't get it. He doesn't get me. Except he did. He'd gotten her in the library, in the archives, under the stars. He'd gotten her when he'd told her that her heartbeat was the most valuable sound in his existence. He'd gotten her when he'd held her hand like she was made of spun glass and whispered times, staying times like a man relearning a word. The king didn't get her, but the man did, and that was what made this hurt so much. There was a knock on the door. It wasn't a servant's knock. It was sharp, demanding, and followed by silence, so absolute she knew exactly who was standing on the other side, not breathing, not shifting his weight, just waiting. Go away, Ashton, she called out. The door opened anyway. He stood there, looking utterly lost. The crown was gone, the regal bearing replaced by a desperate urgency. He filled the doorframe without touching it, perfectly centered, perfectly still, and the hallway behind him was dark in a way that suggested he'd come through it at speed, extinguishing torches in his wake. Delilah, please, he said. You must understand. I was trying to protect you. By turning me into one of them, a landed noble, that's not protection, that's assimilation. I have a life, a career, one that doesn't involve presiding over a bog. I have made a grave error, he said, stepping into the room. He looked at her packed bags, and a look of genuine panic crossed his face, raw and uncontrolled, breaking through the vampiric mask like a crack in marble. I am new to this. New to this? She asked, incredulous. You're 700 years old. I have been a king for 700 years, he countered, his voice rising, and she noticed the candle flames in the room bend away from him, as if his agitation displaced the air. I have not been times me, not for a very long time. I know how to reward a vassal. I know how to eliminate a threat. I do not know how to… He stopped, took a breath he didn't need. In the archives, you asked me to read to you. In the library, you held my hand. Under my father's stars, you kissed me. And I thought, this is it. This is the thing I have been missing for 700 years. And then Malachor came, and they looked at you the way predators look at a deer, and every part of me that is king said times, protect her, fortify her, make her untouchable. And the only language my throne knows is titles and land. His voice broke on the last word. The candle flames steadied. The room was very quiet. I should have asked you, he said, what you needed, what you wanted. Instead, I did what kings do. I gave orders. He looked at her suitcase. Please do not leave. You can't solve me with a duchy, Ashton. I know. You can't make me permanent. You can't title me into immortality. I'm going to… I know. His voice was ragged. I know. You are going to grow old and I am going to watch, and it is going to be the most beautiful and devastating thing I have ever witnessed, and I am asking you to let me witness it, not as a king protecting a subject. As a man who is in love with a woman and is terrified and selfish and willing to endure anything if it means I do not have to go back to the silence. The word times, love times, landed in the room like a stone in still water. He hadn't said it before, neither had she. They'd talked around it, beside it, underneath it. They'd held hands and kissed under stars, and she'd sat with him while he starved, and he'd read her to sleep in the archives, and neither of them had said it, because saying it made the timeline real. Saying times, love times, when one of you is eternal and the other was not a declaration. It was a choice, a choice to accept the cost. He'd said it. He'd made the choice. Delilah looked at him. The ancient king with the cracked voice and the panicked eyes and the 700 years of loneliness sitting behind his carefully maintained facade. The man who'd dented a scaffolding pole because she'd wobbled. Who'd read her a book about column classifications because she'd asked. Who'd shown her his father's stars because she was the first person who'd made him want to unseal the room. "You're in love with me," she said, catastrophically. He confirmed. "And you express this by giving me a swamp." In hindsight, the swamp was not my finest moment. A laugh escaped her. She didn't want it to. She was supposed to be furious, but the laugh came anyway, wet and shaky and full of everything she'd been trying not to feel. "You are the most impossible man I have ever met," she said. "I am not technically a man." "Shut up." She crossed the distance between them, grabbed the front of his shirt, and kissed him. It was not the slow, reverent kiss under the stars. It was messy and fierce and tasted like salt from the tears on her cheeks. He made a sound against her mouth, something between a gasp and a groan, and his arms came around her, lifting her off her feet with an ease that should have been frightening but felt like coming home. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him harder, and his restraint slipped just a fraction, his arms tightening, his mouth opening under hers, and for a moment she felt the full, terrifying scope of what he was, the strength, the hunger, the centuries of compressed need, and she leaned into it instead of away. When they broke apart, he set her down gently, his hands shaking. She could feel the tremor in his fingers, the effort of pulling the power back. "I fell at your feet the first night," he said, his forehead against hers. "When you called me underinteresting, I have been on the ground ever since." "I know," she said. "I watched." "You're cruel, Delilah Vance. And you're mine," she said, and the words were a declaration and a vow and a choice all at once. Swamp and all. He laughed, broken and relieved and full of something that sounded, for the first time in 7 centuries, like hope. Just outside the door, hidden in the shadows of the corridor, Lord Valerius leaned his head back against the cold stone wall and closed his eyes. Finally, he breathed, a 500-year-old weight lifting from his weary shoulders. Later, long after Delilah had fallen asleep, Ashton stood at the window of her room and watched the eastern sky begin to lighten. The first gray fingers of dawn crept across the horizon, and he could feel them like a warning, a low hum of discomfort building beneath his skin. He drew the heavy curtains closed against the coming sun, shutting out the light that would drive him away from her. Then he returned to the chair beside her bed. She had fallen asleep against him on the small settee, and he had carried her to the bed, tucking the blankets around her the way he imagined mortal parents did for mortal children. She had murmured something about lime mortar and curled into the warmth. He had pressed his lips to her forehead and felt her temperature against his cold mouth and thought, this is what I was for. He sat in the dark and listened to her breathe. The rhythm was slow and steady, the heartbeat he'd memorized, the sound he'd told her was his favorite. Outside, the sun rose over his kingdom, and he could not follow it, and she would wake into its light and move through a world he could only inhabit in half. And someday, not today, not for decades if he was fortunate, but someday, the breathing would stop and the heartbeat would end, and he would still be here, in the dark, listening to the silence. He would figure out the rest. He had centuries of patience. She had given him something far more valuable than time. She had given him a reason to use it,